Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Silent Portrait. Chapter 1. The unveiling. The spring afternoon had settled over St. Mary Mead, with the gentle persuasion of warm sunshine, and the scent of lilac drifting through open windows. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual chair by the drawing-room window, her knitting needles clicking in steady rhythm, as she observed the comings and goings along the high street. To the casual observer, she appeared to be nothing more than a harmless elderly lady occupied with her handwork, but her sharp blue eyes missed very little indeed. Today, however, even Miss Marple had abandoned her post for a more intriguing engagement. The entire village had been invited to Gossington Hall for the unveiling of a portrait that had been the subject of considerable speculation for the past 3 months. Gossington Hall, that imposing Georgian structure at the edge of the village, had recently passed into the hands of Mr. Adrian Thornbury, a London art dealer who had inherited the property from a distant cousin. Mr. Thornbury had wasted no time in establishing himself as a figure of some importance in village society, throwing lavish garden parties and making generous donations to the Church Restoration Fund. His wife, Celeste, a striking woman 20 years his junior, with an accent that suggested continental origins, had quickly become the subject of much discussion among the ladies of St. Mary Mead. The portrait in question was of Celeste herself, commissioned from Marcus Bellamy, an artist whose work commanded substantial prices in London galleries. Mr. Thornbury had spared no expense, it seemed, in immortalizing his wife's beauty on canvas. Miss Marple arrived at Gossington Hall in the company of her nephew Raymond's wife, Joan, who had driven down from London for the occasion. The great hall was already filled with guests, a mixture of village residents and what appeared to be more sophisticated visitors from town. Miss Marple noted the presence of Dr. Haydock, their local physician, in conversation with Colonel Melchett, the chief constable, Mrs. Price Ridley. The village's self-appointed social arbiter stood near the draped portrait with her daughter Lettice, both craning their necks to catch an early glimpse. "Quite the gathering," Joan murmured. "I must say, this Mr. Thornbury knows how to throw a party." Miss Marple nodded absently, her attention caught by a young man standing somewhat apart from the crowd. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair and an intensity of expression that suggested either deep thought or deep distress. She had seen him about the village once or twice, staying at the Blue Boar Inn. "That's Peter Carrington," Joan whispered, following her aunt's gaze. "The artist Marcus Bellamy's assistant, rather devoted to his master by all accounts. Came down to help with the portrait sittings." Before Miss Marple could respond, a hush fell over the room. Adrian Thornbury had mounted a small platform beside the covered portrait. He was a man of perhaps 55, well preserved and distinguished, with silver hair and the confident bearing of one accustomed to getting his own way. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily across the hall, "thank you all for joining us on this special occasion. As many of you know, I commissioned this portrait to celebrate not only my beautiful wife, but also the beginning of our new life here in St. Mary Mead. Marcus Bellamy has captured something quite extraordinary. Not merely Celeste's physical beauty, but something of her very essence." He gestured to someone in the crowd, and Miss Marple saw Celeste Thornbury glide forward. She wore a dress of deep sapphire blue that set off her pale skin and dark hair to perfection. There was something almost theatrical about her movements, as though she were perpetually aware of being observed. Marcus Bellamy himself stood near the portrait, a rotund man of about 60 with a florid complexion and an air of self-satisfaction. Miss Marple had heard that he was staying at Gossington Hall for the unveiling. along with his assistant. With a flourish, Adrian Thornbury pulled the covering from the portrait. There was a collective intake of breath. The painting was indeed extraordinary. Celeste had been captured in the same sapphire dress she wore now, seated in the conservatory that overlooked the gardens of Gossington Hall. But it was her expression that arrested the viewer, a look of such profound melancholy, such haunting sadness, that it seemed entirely at odds with the elegant setting and expensive trappings surrounding her. "Good heavens," Joan whispered, "she looks absolutely tragic." The applause that followed was somewhat uncertain, as if the guests weren't quite sure how to respond. Celeste herself stood frozen, staring at her own image with an expression Miss Marple couldn't quite read. Was it shock? Anger? Fear? Marcus Bellamy was beaming, accepting congratulations with evident pleasure. "Art must reveal truth," he proclaimed to those gathered around him. "One cannot paint a lie. The canvas reveals what the subject hides." Miss Marple noticed that Adrian Thornbury's smile had become somewhat fixed. Celeste had turned away from the portrait entirely, her pale face now flushed with what might have been embarrassment or fury. "I need some air," Celeste said abruptly, and made her way through the crowd towards the French doors leading to the terrace. Miss Marple also noticed that Peter Carrington, the young assistant, had gone quite pale. He stared at the portrait with an expression of such naked distress that several people turned to look at him. Then, seeming to collect himself, he hurried from the room. "How very peculiar," Joan observed. "One would think Mr. Bellamy might have shown them the portrait before unveiling it to the entire village." "One would think so indeed," Miss Marple agreed softly, her mind already beginning to work on the small puzzle of human behaviour that had just presented itself. The party continued, though with a slightly strained atmosphere. Servants circulated with champagne and canapés. Groups formed and reformed, conversations buzzing with speculation about the portrait and Celeste's reaction to it. Miss Marple moved quietly through the gathering, listening more than speaking, observing the small dramas playing out in gesture and glance. She had just accepted a glass of sherry from a passing tray when a scream shattered. The pleasant murmur of conversation everyone rushed toward the sound, which had come from the direction of the conservatory. Miss Marple followed more slowly, her heart sinking with a certainty born of long experience. Something terrible had happened. She could feel it in the sudden electric tension that had seized the gathering. When she reached the conservatory, she found a small crowd already gathered at the entrance. Through the pressing bodies, she could see Celeste Thornbury standing rigid, her hand pressed to her mouth. On the floor, sprawled among the orchids and ferns that gave the conservatory its lush, exotic atmosphere, lay Marcus Bellamy. Dr. Haydock was already kneeling beside the artist, but even from where she stood, Miss Marple could see there was no hope. Marcus Bellamy's florid face had gone grey, and his eyes stared sightlessly at the glass ceiling above. Near his hand lay a delicate china teacup, its contents spilled across the tiled floor. "Dead," Dr. Haydock announced grimly, "and unless I'm very much mistaken, poisoned." Chapter 2. Whispers and Suspicions. The transformation of Gossington Hall from a scene of social celebration to one of grim investigation occurred with remarkable swiftness. Colonel Melchett immediately took charge, directing that all guests remain in the drawing room while he secured the conservatory. Inspector Slack, summoned from Much Benham, arrived within the hour, his sharp features set in lines of importance and determination. Miss Marple found herself seated on a settee between Mrs. Bantry, the wife of Colonel Bantry, who owned a property neighbouring Gossington Hall, and young Lettice Price Ridley, whose mother had finally been induced to sit down and cease her hysterical pronouncements about what a shock it all was. "Poison," Mrs. Bantry whispered, her eyes bright with horrified fascination. "In our very midst. Jane, can you credit it?" Miss Marple could indeed credit it, having encountered murder before in her long life. But she merely murmured something non-committal while observing the behaviour of those around her. Adrian Thornbury stood by the fireplace, his earlier bonhomie entirely vanished. He looked haggard, older than his years, occasionally glancing toward his wife, who sat in a chair by the window, wrapped in a shawl despite the warmth of the day. Peter Carrington had returned to the drawing-room and stood in a corner, still pale but now wearing an expression of fierce concentration, as though trying to work through some complicated problem. Near him, a woman of perhaps 40 with striking red hair and green eyes dabbed at her face with a handkerchief. Miss Marple had learned this was Monica Heath, a writer of mystery novels who had been staying in the village to work on her latest book. "I saw him just an hour ago," Monica was saying to Dr. Haydock. "He was in excellent spirits, positively gloating over the portrait. Said it was his masterpiece, that it would make his reputation secure for posterity." "Did he say anything else?" Dr. Haydock asked gently. Monica hesitated. "He said something rather odd, actually. He said, 'The truth will out, as it always does. The canvas doesn't lie.' I thought he was simply being pretentious, as artists often are, but now..." Inspector Slack, a man whose enthusiasm for his work often outpaced his actual competence, had begun questioning the guests systematically. His manner suggested he already had the matter well in hand. "Now then, Mrs. Thornbury," he said, approaching Celeste with his notebook at the ready. "You found the deceased, I understand." Celeste raised her dark eyes to his face. "Yes, I went to the conservatory because I needed to be alone. The portrait upset me. When I entered, I saw him lying there among the plants. At first, I thought he had simply fallen, but then..." She shuddered delicately. "Had you quarrelled with Mr. Bellamy?" "Quarrelled?" Celeste's accent became more pronounced with her agitation. "No, there was no quarrel. I did not like how he painted me, that is true. He made me look," she struggled for the word, "desolate, as though I was some tragic figure. But I did not quarrel with him. I simply left the room. And you went directly to the conservatory?" "No." Celeste looked down at her hands. "First I went upstairs. I needed to compose myself. Then I came down and walked through the library to the conservatory. That is when I found him." Inspector Slack made notes with great industry. "And during this time, did you see anyone else? Anyone who might have entered the conservatory before you?" "I saw no one." Miss Marple listened carefully to this exchange, noting the slight hesitation before Celeste's final answer. Had she seen someone? Or was she simply the sort of woman whose dramatic nature coloured everything with emphasis? The inspector moved on to Adrian Thornbury, who confirmed that he had remained in the drawing-room after the unveiling, circulating among his guests and attempting to smooth over the awkward moment created by his wife's reaction to the portrait. "Mr. Bellamy was my guest," Adrian said stiffly. "I had no reason to wish him harm. Yes, the portrait was unexpected in its interpretation, but these artistic types have their own vision. One must allow for that." "Yet your wife was distressed by it," Slack pressed. "My wife is sensitive. She is not accustomed to seeing herself portrayed in such a manner." Adrian's jaw tightened. "But that is hardly a motive for murder, Inspector. If we killed everyone who painted an unflattering portrait, there would be no artists left in England." A titter ran through some of the assembled guests at this, quickly stifled when Slack glared around the room. Peter Carrington's interview was brief but revealing. Yes, he had been Marcus Bellamy's assistant for 3 years. Yes, he had helped with the portrait sittings. No, he had not known what the final painting would look like until the unveiling. Mr. Bellamy kept his work very private, Peter said, his voice tight with some suppressed emotion. He never showed his paintings until they were complete. Even I, who mixed his paints and prepared his canvases, was not permitted to see the work in progress. And what was your opinion of the portrait? Peter's hands clenched. It was cruel. Whatever Marcus saw in Mrs. Thornbury, he had no right to expose it to the world like that. It was a betrayal. Strong words, Mr. Carrington, Slack observed. Were you fond of Mrs. Thornbury? The young man flushed deeply. I barely know her, but one doesn't need to know someone well to recognize cruelty when one sees it. Miss Marple's needles had resumed their clicking. She had retrieved her knitting bag from the hall, and over their steady rhythm, she heard Monica Heath whisper to her companion, Poor boy, he's been half in love with Celeste since the first sitting. Anyone with eyes could see it. The afternoon wore into evening. Dr. Haydock had taken away the teacup and its remaining contents for analysis, though he had already pronounced himself certain that poison was the cause of death. The specific poison would require more detailed examination, but he suspected something quick-acting and deadly. The question, Colonel Melchett said to a small group that included Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock and Mrs. Bantry, is who had both opportunity and motive. The poison must have been administered in that cup of tea, but who gave it to him? I saw one of the servants offering tea on a tray, Mrs. Bantry said. That young housemaid, what's her name, Rose? She was circulating through the room after the unveiling. We've questioned her, Melchett replied. She says she offered Mr. Bellamy a cup from her tray, but he waved her away. Said he'd get his own from the conservatory, where he preferred to take his tea among the plants. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. How very interesting. So Mr. Bellamy went to the conservatory specifically for tea. Apparently it was his habit, Dr. Haydock confirmed. According to Mr. Thornbury, Bellamy always took tea in the conservatory when he visited. Said it inspired him. All those exotic plants. And was it generally known that he had this habit? Miss Marple inquired gently. I should think so, Melchett said. He'd been here for 3 months, on and off, working on the portrait. The servants certainly knew his preferences. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully and returned to her knitting, but her mind was far from the pattern she was working. Someone had known that Marcus Bellamy would go to the conservatory for his tea. Someone had known it and prepared accordingly. But who? And more importantly, why? As the evening drew on, and Inspector Slack finally released the guests with stern instructions not to leave the village, Miss Marple found herself walking slowly toward the conservatory. The police had finished their initial examination, though the area remained cordoned off. She stood at the entrance, looking in at the scene of the crime. The conservatory was beautiful, filled with rare orchids and tropical ferns, creating a lush jungle effect. In one corner stood a small table where, presumably, tea things were kept for Mr. Bellamy's convenience. The teacup had been removed, but Miss Marple could see where it had fallen, the stain of tea still dark on the tiles. Her eyes travelled upward to the glass ceiling, then around to the various entrances to the conservatory. Besides the door from the house, there were 2 other doors, one leading to the garden, one to a small anteroom that connected to the library. Multiple points of access, then. Anyone might have entered unseen during the confusion following the unveiling. Miss Marple. She turned to find Peter Carrington standing behind her, his face drawn with emotion. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean to startle you. I saw you standing here and wondered. That is, do you think they'll find who did this? I'm quite certain they will, Mr. Carrington, Miss Marple replied gently. The truth has a way of emerging given time and patience. Marcus always said that too. Peter's voice broke slightly. He said the truth always emerged in art. That's what the portrait was about, you see. He painted what he saw in her. The real Celeste, not the beautiful mask she shows the world. You admired him very much. I owed him everything. He took me on when I was nobody. Taught me everything I know about painting. He could be difficult, even cruel sometimes, but he was a genius. And now, Peter's hands clenched into fists. Someone killed him because he told the truth, because he saw too much and painted what he saw. Miss Marple studied the young man's face carefully. You believe the portrait was the reason for his death? What else could it be? Celeste was humiliated. Her husband was angry. And Marcus was planning to write about it, about what he'd discovered during those sittings. He told me just yesterday that this was only the beginning, that the portrait would open doors to the truth about the Thornburys. How very interesting, Miss Marple murmured. And did he tell you what truths he had discovered? Peter hesitated, then shook his head. He said it wasn't time yet, that he needed to be certain. But he was excited, almost feverish about it. Whatever he knew, he intended to reveal it soon. After the young man had gone, Miss Marple stood alone in the gathering dusk, her mind working over the problem, a portrait that revealed unwelcome truths, an artist who intended to reveal more, and now that artist was dead, silenced before he could speak. But what truth had Marcus Bellamy discovered? And who had been desperate enough to kill him to prevent its revelation? These were the questions that occupied Miss Marple as she finally left Gossington Hall and made her way home through the quiet village streets. Somewhere in the events of this afternoon lay the answer. She need only observe carefully enough, remember wisely enough to see it. For in her long experience, she had learned that human nature was remarkably consistent. The passions that led to murder in ancient Rome were the same passions that led to murder in St. Mary Mead. Pride, fear, greed, love, these were the eternal motives, dressed in ever-changing clothes but fundamentally unchanged. And somewhere among the residents and guests of Gossington Hall, one of these passions had led to murder. Chapter 3. Pieces of the Past. The following morning dawned grey and drizzling, matching the sombre mood that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple received several visitors at her cottage, beginning with Dr. Haydock, who stopped by to return a book he had borrowed. Prussic acid, he announced without preamble, settling into a chair by the fire. That's what killed poor Bellamy. Quick-acting and deadly. Must have been in the tea, nowhere else to hide it. The cup contained remnants of a strong Indian blend, enough to mask any bitter taste. How very efficient, Miss Marple observed, setting aside her knitting. One would need to know something about poisons to choose such a method, or simply have access to the right sources. Prussic acid isn't difficult to obtain if one knows where to look. Rat poison, industrial uses, even some plant extracts. Dr. Haydock frowned. The devil of it is, half the people at that party probably could have gotten hold of some, one way or another. And the tea service in the conservatory, was it kept there permanently? According to the housekeeper, yes. Bellamy insisted on it. Had to have his tea a certain way. Very particular about it. The pot was kept warm on a spirit lamp, cups and milk jug all arranged just so. Anyone in the household would have known about it. After Dr. Haydock left, Miss Marple had a visit from Monica Heath, the mystery writer, who arrived carrying a manuscript and an air of barely contained excitement. "I know it's dreadful of me," Monica said, accepting a cup of tea. "But I can't help thinking of it all as material. A real murder right before my eyes. Of course, my fictional murders are all very tidy and logical, not like real life at all. Though I must say, this one does seem to follow a certain pattern, doesn't it?" "What pattern would that be, my dear?" Miss Marple inquired. "Well, the person most obviously humiliated by the portrait, Mrs. Thornbury. She had motive and opportunity. She went off alone after the unveiling, supposedly to compose herself. The conservatory was on her route. She could have slipped in, added the poison to his tea, and then discovered the body later to avoid suspicion." "Yes, that is certainly one possibility," Miss Marple agreed. "Though I wonder why she would have had prussic acid with her at a party." Monica waved this away. She could have prepared it in advance, knowing the portrait was to be unveiled. Perhaps she'd already seen it. Despite what young Carrington said about Bellamy keeping his work private, you've given this considerable thought. "I have indeed, and I'm not the only one. The village is buzzing with theories. Mrs. Price Ridley insists it must have been a vagrant who somehow got into the house. Colonel Melchett thinks it's clearly Peter Carrington. Jealous devotion to Celeste and all that. And Inspector Slack seems to be building a case against Adrian Thornbury himself." "Mr. Thornbury. But why would he kill the artist he commissioned?" Monica leaned forward conspiratorially. "Because of what the portrait revealed, of course. Everyone saw how it painted Celeste as deeply unhappy. What if Bellamy knew something about their marriage? What if he threatened to expose some scandal?" After Monica had departed, still theorizing energetically, Miss Marple sat quietly, considering what she had learned. The prussic acid was significant. It suggested premeditation and some knowledge of poisons. The tea service had been a standing arrangement, known to the household, and the portrait itself had clearly been a catalyst, though whether it was the cause or merely the trigger for something deeper, she could not yet say. That afternoon brought Inspector Slack to her door, looking rather less confident than he had the day before. "Begging your pardon for the intrusion, Miss Marple," he said, accepting her offer to sit down with ill-concealed reluctance. Inspector Slack had encountered Miss Marple's methods before, and had learned, somewhat against his will, to respect them. "Colonel Melchett suggested I might benefit from... That is, he thought you might have observed something yesterday that could prove useful." "How very kind of the Colonel," Miss Marple said, "though I fear I'm just a silly old woman who notices small things. However, there were one or two points that struck me as curious." Slack pulled out his notebook with poorly disguised eagerness. "The portrait itself," Miss Marple began. "It showed Mrs. Thornbury as profoundly sad, did it not? Almost desperate. Yet Mr. Bellamy chose to unveil it publicly, in front of the entire village and various London acquaintances. That seems almost cruel, doesn't it? One wonders why." "Artists are peculiar folk," Slack muttered. "Indeed. But there was something young Mr. Carrington said that interested me. He mentioned that Mr. Bellamy was planning to write about what he'd discovered during the portrait sittings. That suggests he knew something, doesn't it? Something beyond merely observing Mrs. Thornbury's unhappiness. Blackmail, you mean? Oh, I wouldn't use such a strong word. But certainly, if Mr. Bellamy had discovered some secret about the Thornburys, it would explain why the portrait was so revealing. Artists observe very carefully, you know. They see beneath surfaces." Slack made rapid notes. "We've been looking into the Thornburys' background. Adrian Thornbury made his fortune in art dealing. Quite successful by all accounts. Married Celeste 3 years ago in Paris. She was working as a model for various artists there. Nothing scandalous in any of it." "How nice," Miss Marple murmured. "And Mr. Carrington? What do you know of him? Devoted to Bellamy, worked as his assistant for 3 years. No money to speak of, lives off what Bellamy paid him. Young man from a good family, fallen on hard times. Came down for the portrait sittings, as Mrs. Thornbury required a chaperone. Very proper, all that. Bellamy's reputation with women wasn't entirely savoury. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. How interesting. So young Mr. Carrington was present during all the sittings? So he claims. Says he was in and out, preparing materials, running errands. But yes, he'd have been around. And no doubt observed quite a lot himself. After Inspector Slack departed, Miss Marple decided a walk through the village would be beneficial. Exercise was important at her age, and there was nothing like a gentle stroll to stimulate thought. She made her way toward Gossington Hall, though she had no particular intention of calling there. Sometimes, she found, simply being near the scene of a crime helped one think more clearly about it. As she walked along the lane that skirted the estate, she encountered Celeste Thornbury herself, walking alone in the gardens. The younger woman looked pale but composed, dressed simply in a grey frock that made her seem less theatrical than she had at the party. "Miss Marple," Celeste said, seeming relieved to see a familiar face. "You are well, I hope. Such a terrible day yesterday." "Quite well, thank you, my dear. And you? You've had a great shock." Celeste's hands twisted together. "It is like a nightmare. That portrait, and then Marcus dead, and the police everywhere with their questions. Adrian is beside himself. He blames himself for bringing Marcus here." "You knew Mr. Bellamy before your husband commissioned the portrait?" "Oh yes, in Paris before I met Adrian. Marcus painted many of the models, though I never sat for him then. He had a reputation. Not a kind man, you understand, but brilliant. When Adrian suggested commissioning a portrait, I was not entirely pleased, but—" She shrugged elegantly. "One does not refuse such a gift." "The sittings must have been trying. They were terrible." Celeste's composure cracked slightly. He would stare and stare, hardly speaking, and then he would ask questions. Such personal questions. About my past, my feelings, my dreams. I thought it was for the art, you understand, to capture the, how do you say, the essence. But he was probing, always probing. "And did you tell him the truth?" Celeste's dark eyes met hers, and Miss Marple saw real fear there. "Some truths are better left unspoken, Miss Marple." Marcus did not understand this. He thought truth was everything, that art must reveal all. But some things are private. Before Miss Marple could respond, Adrian Thornbury appeared on the terrace, calling to his wife. Celeste excused herself quickly and hurried back to the house, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. That evening, Miss Marple invited Mrs. Bantry and Dr. Haydock for dinner. Over a simple meal of cold chicken and salad, they discussed the case. "The problem," Mrs. Bantry declared, "is that everyone had a motive." Celeste was humiliated. Adrian was angry. Peter Carrington was defensive of both Celeste and his master's memory. Though, how those two things work together, I can't imagine. Even Monica Heath might have done it, for material for her next book. Opportunity is equally widespread, Dr. Haydock added. The conservatory was accessible from multiple points. During the confusion after the unveiling, anyone could have slipped in. "Yes," Miss Marple said slowly, "but the poison had to be obtained beforehand. That suggests planning. Whoever killed Mr. Bellamy knew he would be unveiling the portrait yesterday, and anticipated needing to silence him." "But why yesterday specifically?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "If this was about secrets he'd discovered, why not kill him weeks ago, before the portrait was finished?" "An excellent question," Miss Marple agreed. "Perhaps because the portrait itself was necessary for something. Or perhaps because Mr. Bellamy made some announcement, some threat, that precipitated action. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. Carrington mentioned that Bellamy was planning to write about what he'd discovered. Perhaps he announced this intention recently? That would make sense, Miss Marple said. The portrait was one thing, open to interpretation, potentially dismissed as artistic license, but a written account of whatever secrets he'd uncovered, that would be far more dangerous to someone. Then we need to find out what those secrets were, Mrs. Bantry said firmly. Chapter 4. Shadows and Revelations. The next morning brought Inspector Slack back to Miss Marple's cottage, this time accompanied by Colonel Melchett. Both men looked rather grim. "We've made an arrest," Slack announced without preamble. "Peter Carrington. Found prussic acid in his room at the Blue Boar, a small bottle tucked away in his painting supplies." Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. "How very interesting. And Mr. Carrington's explanation? Claims he knows nothing about it," Melchett said, settling heavily into a chair. "Says someone must have planted it there. The usual protest of innocence. But you're not convinced?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Slack shifted uncomfortably. "The evidence is clear enough. He had means and opportunity. As for motive, the young man was in love with Mrs. Thornbury," Melchett finished. "Several witnesses have confirmed it. Bellamy's portrait humiliated her, and Bellamy himself was reportedly planning to write something that would further expose her. Carrington might have killed to protect her." Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her fingers still on the handle of her teacup. "Tell me, Inspector, when exactly did you search Mr. Carrington's room?" "This morning at first light. Why?" "And the Blue Boar? Is it the sort of establishment where rooms are kept locked?" "Not particularly. It's not a fancy hotel, just a village inn. The doors have keys, but most guests don't bother locking them during the day." "So, anyone might have entered Mr. Carrington's room and placed the poison there." Slack's face reddened. "That's what he claims, but it's a convenient claim," Melchett interrupted. "The bottle was hidden quite carefully, Miss Marple. Not the sort of hiding place someone would choose if they were quickly planting evidence." "Unless," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "they were someone who knew Mr. Carrington's habits well enough to choose a spot he himself might have used. Someone who had access to his belongings and knew how to make it look authentic." The two men exchanged glances. "You think he's been framed?" Melchett asked. "I think," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that before one arrests someone for murder, one should be quite certain of the case. Tell me, have you discovered what secrets Mr. Bellamy uncovered about the Thornburys?" "We're still investigating," Slack admitted. "But we did learn something interesting from the servants at Gossington Hall. About 2 weeks ago, there was a tremendous row between Bellamy and Adrian Thornbury. The butler overheard part of it. Bellamy was apparently threatening to reveal something about Celeste's past. Her past in Paris, perhaps? Possibly. Thornbury was furious, told Bellamy to keep his mouth shut, or he'd regret it. Bellamy just laughed and said the truth would come out in the portrait anyway." After the men had gone, Miss Marple sat in deep thought. The picture was becoming clearer, though several pieces were still missing. A secret from Celeste's past, important enough that Bellamy thought it worth revealing, important enough that it might drive someone to murder. But was it Celeste herself who had killed to protect that secret? Or Adrian to protect his wife? Or could it indeed be Peter Carrington, acting from misguided devotion? She decided to pay a call on Monica Heath, who had taken rooms at the vicarage. The mystery writer might have observed something useful with her. Trained eye for narrative and motive. Monica greeted her warmly and immediately launched into her thoughts on the arrest. "It's too obvious," she declared. In my books, the person with the prussic acid in their room never turns out to be the real killer. It's always planted evidence. Though I must admit in real life, perhaps things are more straightforward. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, though I've always found that human beings are remarkably consistent in their behaviour. The same patterns repeat themselves, generation after generation. Tell me, Miss Heath, you've been observing the Thornburys quite closely, haven't you? For your writing. Monica had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. I confess I have been taking notes. It's a terrible habit, but a writer can't help it. And the Thornburys are fascinating subjects. What have you observed? Monica considered for a moment. Celeste is afraid of something, that's obvious. She startles easily, watches Adrian constantly, as though gauging his mood. Adrian himself is charming on the surface, but controlling beneath. I've seen him give his wife certain looks when she speaks to other men. Not jealous exactly, but proprietary. And the portrait. What did you make of that? It was extraordinary. Bellamy captured something I'd sensed, but never quite articulated. A deep sadness in Celeste, almost a desperation, as though she were trapped in something and couldn't escape. Miss Marple nodded slowly. In your research for your mystery novels, Miss Heath, have you ever investigated cases of assumed identity? Monica's eyes widened. Do you think? Oh, how clever. Yes, I have researched such cases. It's a classic mystery element. Someone pretending to be someone they're not, hiding from a past identity. And in your research, what are the typical reasons someone might assume a false identity? Monica leaned forward eagerly, usually to escape scandal, debt, or criminal prosecution, sometimes to escape an unwanted marriage or family situation. In the case of women, occasionally to escape prostitution or other unsavory circumstances. She paused, then added more quietly, or sometimes simply to escape poverty and create a new, more advantageous life. How very thorough, Miss Marple murmured. And if such a person married someone of wealth and position under a false identity, and that truth were discovered, it would be grounds for scandal, possibly for legal action. The marriage might even be invalid if the identity were completely fabricated. Monica's face lit with understanding. You think Celeste isn't who she claims to be? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that Mr. Bellamy discovered something during those portrait sittings, something that showed in Celeste's face. The fear, the desperation you observed. And I think he was cruel enough, or truthful enough, depending on one's perspective, to intend to reveal it. After leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple made her way to the church, where she found the vicar's wife, Griselda, arranging flowers. Miss Marple, how lovely to see you, though I suppose you're here about this dreadful murder business. Partly, Miss Marple admitted, but also I wondered if you might help me with something. You know the village records quite well, don't you? Reasonably well. What are you looking for? Information about the Thornburys when they first arrived. They had references, I assume. Letters of introduction from their previous church, that sort of thing. Griselda's brow furrowed. Now that you mention it, I don't recall seeing any. They simply arrived and began attending services. Adrian made a generous donation to the Restoration Fund, which naturally endeared him to Leonard. But formal references? No, I don't think there were any. How interesting. And Mrs. Thornbury? Has she been active in the church? Not particularly. She attends services with her husband, sits quietly in the back, leaves quickly afterward. I've tried to engage her in the Women's Institute, but she always has excuses. Pleasant enough, but distant. As though she were avoiding close friendships. Exactly that. I thought perhaps she simply wasn't comfortable in village life, being continental and used to Paris. But now you put it that way. Miss Marple thanked her and departed, her mind working steadily through the accumulating evidence. A woman who avoided close relationships. No references from a previous church. A past in Paris that she clearly didn't wish examined too closely, and an artist who had somehow uncovered whatever secret she was hiding. That afternoon, Miss Marple did something quite unusual. She took the train to London. She arrived at Scotland Yard just as the offices were preparing to close for the day, but her gentle persistence and a fortunate encounter with an old acquaintance, Sir Henry Clithering, a former commissioner, gained her access to the records she sought. "Looking into the Thornbury case?" Sir Henry asked, showing her to a small office where she could review files. "I heard about the arrest. Young Carrington, wasn't it?" "Yes, though I have my doubts." "Sir Henry, do you have any records of women reported missing from London or Paris in the past 5 years? Particularly women who might have been models or connected to the art world?" Sir Henry raised his eyebrows, but made a telephone call. Within an hour, Miss Marple was reviewing a file that made her nod with grim satisfaction. She took careful notes, thanked Sir Henry profusely, and caught the evening train back to St. Mary Mead. Chapter 5. The Web Tightens. Miss Marple arrived home late that evening to find Dr. Haydock waiting on her doorstep, looking concerned. "Where have you been, Jane? We were worried. It's not like you to go gallivanting off to London without a word." "I had some research to conduct," Miss Marple replied, unlocking her door. "Come in, Doctor. I think you should hear what I've discovered." Over a pot of strong tea, Miss Marple laid out what she had learned at Scotland Yard. 5 years ago, a young woman named Marie Deschamps disappeared from Paris. She was a model and minor actress, known to work in some of the less reputable establishments. She had been involved with a wealthy English businessman and was rumoured to be pregnant. The businessman denied any relationship with her, and Marie simply vanished. Her family filed a missing persons report, but nothing was ever found. Dr. Haydock leaned forward. "You think Marie Deschamps is Celeste Thornbury?" "I think it's possible. The physical descriptions match. Dark hair, pale skin, petite build. The age is right, and it would explain everything. Her fear, her reluctance to form close friendships that might lead to questions about her past, her reaction to Bellamy's portrait. But Bellamy knew her in Paris. Surely he would have recognized her. Perhaps he did eventually, or perhaps Marie Deschamps had changed enough. Better clothes, better circumstances, a more refined accent, that it took him time to piece it together. Those portrait sittings gave him hours to observe her closely, to ask probing questions. He might have started to suspect, and then confirmed it somehow. And Adrian Thornbury. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. That's the question, isn't it? Did Adrian know he was marrying Marie Deschamps? Or did he believe he was marrying Celeste, whoever she claimed to be? If he knew, he'd have reason to silence Bellamy to protect both his wife and his own reputation. Indeed, and if he didn't know, and Bellamy told him the truth, he'd have been furious, betrayed, might have killed in anger. The next morning, Miss Marple shared her findings with Colonel Melchett and Inspector Slack in the Colonel's study. Melchett looked grave as he reviewed her notes. "This changes things considerably," he admitted. "We need to verify this information, of course. But if Celeste Thornbury is indeed this Marie Deschamps, and if Bellamy threatened to expose her, both she and her husband had strong motives for murder," Slack finished. "Stronger than Carrington's infatuation." "What about Carrington?" Miss Marple asked. "Has he said anything further?" "Still protests his innocence," Slack said. "Claims he loved Bellamy like a father, that he'd never have harmed him. Says the prussic acid must have been planted." "Have you searched anyone else's belongings?" slack shifted uncomfortably. Well, no. Once we found the evidence in Carrington's room, it seemed clear enough. Miss Marple's lips tightened, almost imperceptibly. I wonder, Inspector, if you might conduct a search of Gossington Hall, particularly the Thornburys' private rooms. On what grounds? And on the grounds that if Mr. Carrington was indeed framed, the real murderer might still have evidence connecting them to the crime. Prussic acid is not easy to obtain. There might be purchase records, correspondence, something that would point to the true killer. Melchett nodded slowly. She's right, Slack. We should have done a thorough search immediately. Get a warrant and search the premises. The Thornburys' rooms, the servants' quarters, everything. While the police were thus occupied, Miss Marple decided to take a more direct approach. She called upon Gossington Hall and asked to speak with Celeste Thornbury privately. Celeste received her in the morning room, looking wan and nervous. "Miss Marple, is there news? Have they discovered who really killed Marcus?" "That's what I've come to discuss with you, my dear." Miss Marple settled into a chair and fixed Celeste with a kind but penetrating gaze. "I've been doing some research, you see, into the past, into Paris 5 years ago." Celeste went absolutely still, her face draining of colour. "I know about Marie Deschamps," Miss Marple said gently. "About her disappearance, her involvement with an English businessman, her pregnancy. I know that you are Marie Deschamps." For a long moment, Celeste said nothing. Then, slowly, she crumpled, covering her face with her hands. "How did you know?" she whispered. "The pattern was there, once one looked carefully. Your fear of close relationships, your lack of references, your reaction to a portrait that captured your desperate unhappiness, and Mr. Bellamy's threat to reveal what he'd discovered. He recognized you, didn't he?" Celeste nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Not at first. I had changed. Better clothes, better speech, a different life. But during the sittings, he kept staring at me, asking questions. And then one day he said, 'I know who you are. I know what you were.' He had seen me in Paris, you see, though we never spoke. He knew I had been Marie, and he threatened to expose you. Yes, he said the truth must be revealed, that his art demanded it. That's why the portrait showed me so sad, so trapped, because that's how I felt, knowing he could destroy everything." She looked up at Miss Marple with desperate eyes. "I worked so hard to escape that life, Miss Marple. I was nobody, nothing, just a girl used by men and thrown away. When I met Adrian, he saw me as something better. He loved me. I couldn't let Marcus destroy that. Does your husband know the truth?" "No. Adrian thinks I was a respectable model, perhaps a bit poor, but nothing shameful. If he knew about Marie, about the things I did to survive..." She shuddered. "He would cast me off. I would have nothing again." "So you killed Marcus Bellamy to protect your secret?" Celeste's eyes widened in shock. "No! No, Miss Marple, I swear I didn't kill him. I wanted to, God help me, I thought about it, but I couldn't. I'm not brave enough for murder. I thought. I hoped I could convince Marcus to stay silent, or perhaps disappear myself before he could tell anyone. But kill him? No." Miss Marple studied the younger woman's face carefully. She had interviewed many liars in her long life, people who denied wrongdoing with every appearance of sincerity. But there was something in Celeste's fear, in her absolute terror, that rang true. This was a woman afraid of being discovered, yes, but not a woman who had committed murder. "If you didn't kill him," Miss Marple said slowly, "then who did?" "I don't know. I've thought and thought, but I don't know. Perhaps it was someone from my past, someone who followed me here, perhaps..." She stopped, her face going even paler. "Yes, perhaps it was Adrian." The words came out as barely a whisper. Perhaps Marcus told him the truth, and Adrian killed him in rage. Then I would be responsible anyway, you see. My lies would have caused Marcus's death, even if I didn't do the killing myself. Before Miss Marple could respond, there was a commotion in the hallway. Raised voices, footsteps, and then Adrian Thornbury burst into the morning room, followed closely by Inspector Slack. "What's the meaning of this?" Adrian demanded. "These police have been ransacking our rooms like common criminals." "We have a warrant, Mr. Thornbury," Slack said stiffly, "and we've found something very interesting." He held up a small bundle of letters, tied with a ribbon, hidden in your desk drawer behind a false panel. Letters from Marcus Bellamy to a certain Marie Deschamps, written 5 years ago in Paris. Adrian's face went slack with shock. He turned slowly to look at his wife, and the expression in his eyes made Celeste shrink back in her chair. "Marie Deschamps," he repeated slowly. "You're Marie Deschamps? The woman Bellamy wrote about in these letters? The woman he... He couldn't seem to finish the sentence. "Adrian, please," Celeste whispered. "Let me explain." But Adrian had already turned away, his shoulders rigid with fury. "I commissioned a portrait of my wife. Instead, Bellamy painted his former... Again he couldn't finish. He knew all along who you really were, and he painted it for everyone to see. God, the humiliation. Mr. Thornbury," Miss Marple said quietly, "perhaps you should sit down." "Sit down? Sit down? My entire life is a lie, built on the deception of a woman who—" He stopped, seeming to realize for the first time that the police were present. "Get out, all of you, get out of my house." "I'm afraid that's not possible, sir," Inspector Slack said. "We have more questions to ask, particularly about your whereabouts during the party, and about your knowledge of prussic acid." "Are you accusing me of murder?" "We're investigating all possibilities, Mr. Thornbury, including the possibility that you discovered your wife's true identity and killed Marcus Bellamy to prevent him from exposing her." "I didn't know," Adrian shouted. "I knew nothing until this moment. If I had known, I would have—" He stopped abruptly, seeming to realize what he was about to say. "Yes, Mr. Thornbury," Slack pressed. "What would you have done?" But Adrian had regained some of his composure. "I want my solicitor," he said flatly. "I'll answer no more questions without legal representation." Chapter 6. Threads Unraveling. The discovery of the letters sent shockwaves through both Gossington Hall and the village at large. By that evening, everyone in St. Mary Mead knew that Celeste Thornbury had been living under an assumed identity, and speculation ran wild about what other secrets might be hidden in the elegant facade of Gossington Hall. Miss Marple, however, remained troubled. She sat in her parlour that evening with Mrs. Bantry and Dr. Haydock, trying to work through the contradictions in the case. "The letters prove that Bellamy knew Marie Deschamps in Paris," Dr. Haydock said, "and they're quite explicit about their relationship. He was one of the men who used her, though he seems to have had some genuine feeling for her as well." "But why keep the letters?" Mrs. Bantry wondered. "Surely if Adrian knew about them, he'd have destroyed them." "Unless he didn't find them until recently," Miss Marple suggested. "The servants say Adrian had been working in his study late at night for the past week, going through old papers. Perhaps he found the letters then, realized who his wife really was, and confronted Bellamy." "Leading to the murder," Dr. Haydock concluded. "It fits, Jane, does it?" Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked at her friends thoughtfully. "Consider the sequence of events. The portrait was commissioned 3 months ago. Bellamy came to Gossington Hall, conducted sittings with Celeste, and gradually realized who she was. He painted that realization into the portrait. Her fear, her desperation, her entrapment. All of this took time, yes, so. So if Adrian had known the truth before yesterday, why allow the portrait to be unveiled? Why invite the entire village to see his humiliation? A man who had just discovered his wife's deception and murdered to protect that secret would surely cancel the unveiling, not proceed with it. Mrs. Bantry nodded slowly. That's true, unless what? Unless Adrian didn't know about the letters until after the murder. What if Bellamy told him during the party itself? What if Adrian killed him in a sudden rage, and only later discovered the letters when searching for evidence to understand what Bellamy had known? But the prussic acid, Miss Marple objected gently. That requires premeditation. One doesn't carry poison to a party on the off chance one might need it. Dr. Hoydock frowned. Then we're back to the question of who planned this murder in advance. Someone who knew about the portrait unveiling, knew about Bellamy's habits, and had obtained prussic acid beforehand, and planted it in Peter Carrington's room to frame him, Mrs. Bantry added. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. That's the part that troubles me most. Framing young Carrington suggests calculation, cold-blooded planning. It's not the act of someone who killed in a moment of passion. The next morning brought a new development. Peter Carrington had been released on bail, thanks to the intervention of his family solicitor, who argued that the evidence against him was circumstantial and possibly planted. He came immediately to call on Miss Marple, looking haggard but determined. I know everyone thinks I killed Marcus, he said without preamble, because I loved Celeste and wanted to protect her. But it's not true, Miss Marple. I did love her, I still do, but I would never have harmed Marcus. He was difficult, sometimes cruel, but he was also brilliant. He taught me everything about art, about seeing the truth beneath surfaces. Tell me about the letters, Miss Marple said, the ones the police found in Mr. Thornbury's desk. Did you know about them? Peter hesitated. I knew Marcus had known Celeste in Paris. He told me the day before he died. He was excited, almost giddy. He said he'd discovered something wonderful. That Celeste wasn't just any model from Paris, but someone he'd once cared for deeply. He showed me one of the letters he'd written to her years ago. I don't know where he kept them, but clearly not very safely if Adrian found them. Did Mr. Bellamy tell anyone else about this discovery? I don't think so. He wanted it to be a revelation at the unveiling, to show the portrait and then explain its significance. He loved drama, loved being the center of attention. And the prussic acid in your room? Have you any idea how it got there? None at all. I don't even know what prussic acid looks like. I've been going over and over it in my mind. Who had access to my room? Who would want to frame me? The only people who even knew which room I was staying in were Marcus, the Thornburys, and the staff at the Blue Boar. After Peter left, Miss Marple sat in deep thought. The case had become more tangled rather than less. She had the pieces of the puzzle. Celeste's false identity, Bellamy's discovery and threatened exposure, Adrian's likely ignorance until the letters were found, Peter's unrequited love. But they didn't fit together in a way that pointed clearly to one killer. She decided to visit the Blue Boar Inn, where Peter had been staying. Sometimes one learned more from places than from people. The landlord, Mr. Jenkins, was happy to discuss his guest. Nice young man, Mr. Carrington. Quiet, kept to himself mostly. Spent his days up at Gossington Hall, helping with the portrait. Did he have many visitors? None that I saw. Though to be fair, Miss Marple, people come and go from the inn all day. Anyone could have gone upstairs without my noticing, especially during the busy luncheon period. And the day of the party. Was Mr. Carrington here at all? Oh, yes. He came back mid-morning to change his clothes. Wanted to look smart for the unveiling, I suppose. Was here perhaps half an hour, then left again for Gossington Hall. Did anyone else come by during that time? Mr. Jenkins scratched his head thoughtfully. Now you mention it, there was someone. A woman, well-dressed, wore a veil. Said she was looking for a room for the night. I showed her several, including the ones on Mr. Carrington's floor. But she decided they weren't suitable and left. Odd that, looking back on it. Can you describe her at all? Hard to say with the veil. Medium height, slender, well-spoken, but with an accent. Foreign, maybe? Or just upper class? Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind working rapidly. A veiled woman seen near Peter's room on the day of the murder. A woman who might have been Celeste, trying to place evidence that would divert suspicion from herself. Or might have been Monica Heath, the mystery writer, who had admitted to being fascinated by the case and might have been doing research of a more sinister kind. Or might have been someone else entirely. Someone they hadn't yet considered. She was so lost in thought that she nearly collided with Monica Heath herself, who was standing outside the inn with a notebook in hand. Miss Marple, I was just coming to see you. I've had the most extraordinary idea about the case. Have you indeed? Yes, what if the murder wasn't about Celeste's past at all? What if it was about something else entirely? Something we've all been missing because we've been so focused on the obvious motive. Go on, Miss Marple said, intrigued despite herself. What if Marcus Bellamy was killed because of his art itself? Not because of what the portrait revealed about Celeste, but because of its value. Bellamy's paintings are worth thousands of pounds, and a scandal like this, a murdered artist, a portrait at the centre of a mystery, would make his final work priceless. That's a very cynical view, Miss Heath. But not inaccurate. Who owns the portrait now? Adrian Thornbury, presumably. A portrait that will be worth 10 times what he paid for it, now that its creator has been murdered. Miss Marple considered this. An interesting theory, though it would require extraordinary cold-bloodedness to kill a man to increase the value of his art. Art dealers can be quite cold-blooded, Miss Marple. I've researched them for my books. Some would do almost anything for a valuable piece. After parting from Monica, Miss Marple made her way slowly home, thinking about all she had learned. That evening she received an unexpected visitor, Celeste Thornbury, arriving just as dusk was falling. Miss Marple, I need your help, Celeste said urgently. Adrian won't speak to me. He's locked himself in his study and refuses to come out. I'm frightened, Miss Marple. I think he might do something terrible. Terrible in what way? I don't know, but I heard him talking to himself through the door, saying things like, "It all makes sense now," and I should have seen it before. Miss Marple, what if he's planning to harm himself? Or what if... She stopped, her face going pale. What if he realizes that I must have killed Marcus, and he's deciding what to do about it? But you told me you didn't kill Mr. Bellamy. I didn't, but Adrian might not believe me. And the evidence, the portrait, my reaction to it, my past, it all points to me, doesn't it? Miss Marple looked at the frightened woman before her and made a decision. Come with me, she said. We're going to Gossington Hall, and we're going to get to the bottom of this once and for all. Chapter 7. The confrontation Gossington Hall was dark, except for a light burning in Adrian Thornbury's study. Miss Marple and Celeste entered quietly through the front door, which, surprisingly, had been left unlocked, and made their way down the corridor toward the study. Before they could knock, the door opened and Adrian stood in the doorway. He looked haggard, as though he hadn't slept in days, but there was a strange, feverish intensity in his eyes. "I thought you might come," he said, looking past his wife to Miss Marple. "You're the one who's been investigating, aren't you? The one who uncovered my wife's past?" "Mr. Thornbury," Miss Marple said calmly, "I think it's time we all sat down and discussed what really happened the day Mr. Bellamy died." "Do you?" Adrian laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Do you think talking will change anything? Will it change the fact that my wife is a liar? That my marriage is a fraud? That a man was murdered in my house?" "Adrian, please," Celeste began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "No, I'm done with your lies, Celeste. Or should I call you Marie? I spent the past day reading those letters, you see. Reading about what you were, what you did. Bellamy wrote about you in such detail, such intimate detail." His hands clenched into fists. "He knew you better than I ever did. He'd had you before I even met you." "That's not fair," Celeste whispered. "I was young, desperate. I did what I had to do to survive. And then I met you, and I wanted to be someone different, someone better. I loved you, Adrian. I still love you. Love built on lies is no love at all." Adrian turned his attention back to Miss Marple. "You want to know what happened? I'll tell you. I found those letters 3 days before the party. I was looking for some old business papers, and there they were, hidden in a secret compartment I'd forgotten existed. The previous owner must have left them there." "So Mr. Bellamy left the letters in your house?" Miss Marple asked. "So it seems. Careless of him, or perhaps arrogant, thinking his hiding place would never be discovered. When I read them, I realized who Celeste really was. I confronted Bellamy privately, the day before the unveiling. I told him I knew everything, and I demanded that he leave and take his damned portrait with him. But he refused," Miss Marple said. "Worse than that. He laughed at me, said the portrait was his masterpiece, that it revealed the truth about Celeste, and that he intended to explain it all at the unveiling. He said the world deserved to know the story behind the painting, that it would make the work legendary. He didn't care that it would destroy my wife, destroy our marriage, make us both the subject of scandal. All he cared about was his art and his reputation." "So you killed him," Celeste said, her voice breaking. "You killed him to protect me." But Adrian shook his head. "No, I wanted to kill him, God knows, but I didn't. Because despite everything, despite your lies and deception, I still loved you. I couldn't bring myself to become a murderer for your sake." Miss Marple listened to this exchange with great attention, observing not just the words, but the emotions behind them. Adrian was telling the truth. She was sure of it. He was angry, hurt, betrayed, but he was not a killer. "Then who did kill Mr. Bellamy?" she asked quietly. "I've been trying to work that out," Adrian said. "I thought at first it must have been Celeste, protecting herself. But the poison in Carrington's room, that wasn't her style. Too calculated, too clever. Celeste acts on emotion, not cold planning." "Thank you for that, at least," Celeste murmured. "Then I thought perhaps it was Carrington himself," Adrian continued, "protecting the woman he loved, or perhaps angry at Marcus for exploiting her in Paris. But that didn't fit either. Carrington worshipped Bellamy. He'd never have harmed him." "So you've reached an impasse," Miss Marple said. "Not quite." Adrian's expression hardened. "I've realized something. The person who killed Marcus had to have known about the letters, about Celeste's past, before I found them. They had to have a motive that went deeper than just protecting Celeste from exposure." "And you know who that person is?" "I think so. I think the killer is—" But before he could finish, there was a crash from somewhere else in the house. All three of them froze, then hurried toward the sound. It had come from the conservatory. They found Peter Carrington there, standing amid the shattered remains of what had once been Bellamy's portrait. He held a knife in his hand. Apparently he had slashed the canvas to ribbons, and his face was streaked with tears. "I couldn't let it exist," he said, his voice shaking. "I couldn't let it continue to hurt people. It was destroying everyone, Celeste, Adrian, even me. Better to destroy it now than let it cause more pain." "Mr. Carrington," Miss Marple said gently, "destroying the portrait won't change what happened. The truth is still the truth." "The truth?" Peter laughed wildly. Marcus's truth was poison. He saw darkness everywhere, even where there was only light. He saw shame where there was only survival. He saw guilt where there was only youth and desperation. "You loved Mrs. Thornbury," Miss Marple observed. "Of course I loved her. From the first sitting, I saw how beautiful she was, how brave to have escaped whatever life she'd lived before. But Marcus saw only what he wanted to see, saw only what would serve his art. And so you killed him." Peter's face went white. No, I told you, I didn't kill him." "Then who did, Mr. Carrington? Who poisoned Marcus Bellamy?" Before Peter could answer, another voice spoke from the doorway. "I think I can answer that question." They all turned to see Monica Heath standing there, her face calm, almost serene, and in her hand she held a small pistol. Chapter 8. The Revelation. "Miss Heath." Adrian stared at the mystery writer in shock. "What are you doing with a gun?" "Ensuring that the truth comes out, Mr. Thornbury. The real truth, not the convenient fiction everyone seems determined to believe." Monica stepped further into the conservatory, keeping the gun trained steadily on the group. "Miss Marple, I believe you've worked it out. You're too clever not to have done so." Miss Marple looked at Monica with sad, knowing eyes. "Yes, I'm afraid I have, though I must admit it took me longer than it should have. I was distracted by all the obvious motives: Celeste's secret, Adrian's betrayal, Peter's devotion. But none of them quite fit the calculated nature of the crime. The prussic acid," Monica said. "That's what gave it away, wasn't it? The premeditation, the careful planning. That, and the framing of Mr. Carrington. It was too clever, too literary, like something from a mystery novel." Monica smiled. "I've always believed that art should imitate life, or is it the other way around? I can never remember." "Why?" Celeste whispered. "Why did you kill Marcus? You barely knew him." "Oh, but I did know him, Mrs. Thornbury. Or should I say, Marie? I knew him very well indeed. You see, I'm not just a mystery writer. I'm also the daughter of Sophie Deschamps." The name meant nothing to the others, but Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Marie Deschamps' mother, the woman who filed the missing persons report 5 years ago. My mother spent the last 2 years of her life searching for Marie, never knowing what had happened to her daughter. She died believing Marie had been killed by one of the men who used her. And in a way, that was true. Marie did die, killed by the life those men forced her into. She just happened to rise again, as Celeste." "You knew who I was?" Celeste looked stunned. "How? I saw your photograph in the newspaper when the Thornburys first arrived in St. Mary Mead. I'd been searching for you for 3 years, ever since my mother died. I recognized you immediately, despite the new name, the new life. I came to the village to observe you, to decide what to do about you." "But you killed Marcus," Peter said, "not Celeste." Because Marcus was the real villain in all of this. Monica's composure cracked slightly. Do you know what those letters contained? Not just descriptions of sexual encounters, but detailed accounts of how he manipulated Marie, used her, convinced her to degrade herself for his artistic inspiration. He used her up and cast her aside, just like all the others. And then, years later, when he recognized her as Celeste, did he feel any remorse? No. He planned to expose her, to humiliate her again, all for the sake of his precious art. So you poisoned him, Miss Marple said quietly. I prepared the prussic acid carefully, over several weeks. It's not difficult if you know chemistry. I've researched poisons extensively for my books. I knew about Bellamy's habit of taking tea in the conservatory. I simply prepared a special cup for him the morning of the party, left it with the tea service, and waited. He made himself his own death warrant. And you planted evidence in Mr. Carrington's room to frame him for the crime. I needed a scapegoat. Peter was the obvious choice. He was devoted to both Bellamy and Celeste. He had access. He was staying at a public inn where anyone might have entered his room. It was perfect. Adrian had been listening with growing horror. You're insane! You killed a man and tried to frame an innocent person, all because of something that happened years ago. I'm seeking justice, Monica corrected him coldly. Justice for my mother, who died broken-hearted. Justice for Marie, who was exploited and used. Justice for all the women men like Bellamy destroy in their pursuit of art and beauty. But Marie, Celeste, doesn't want this justice, Peter said. You've made everything worse for her. I? Her secret would have come out anyway, once Bellamy unveiled the portrait and told his story. At least this way, he can't tell it in his own twisted words. At least this way, he paid for what he did. Miss Marple had been watching Monica carefully throughout this speech. Now she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. Miss Heath, the gun you're holding isn't going to solve anything. If you shoot someone, you'll simply be making things worse for yourself. You've already confessed to murder. Let us help you now. Help me? Monica laughed. How exactly would you help me, Miss Marple? By seeing me hanged for killing a man who deserved to die? By ensuring that the truth is told, all of it, including what Mr. Bellamy did to your cousin Marie, including the circumstances that drove you to this desperate act. The courts may show some mercy if they understand your motives. Mercy? Monica's hand trembled slightly, but the gun remained pointed at the group. There's no mercy in the law, Miss Marple, only punishment. I know how this ends. I've written it a dozen times in my books. The clever murderer confesses, is arrested, and faces the gallows. I'm not a fool. No, Miss Marple agreed. You're not a fool. You're an intelligent woman driven by grief and a desire for vengeance. But you've made one critical error in your planning. Monica's eyes narrowed. And what would that be? You assumed that Marie, Celeste, wanted vengeance as much as you did. But look at her. Miss Marple gestured to where Celeste stood, tears streaming down her face. Does she look grateful for what you've done? Does she look as though you've freed her from some burden? Monica's gaze flickered to Celeste, and for the first time, uncertainty crossed her face. I didn't want this, Celeste said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Marcus was cruel to paint me that way, to threaten to expose me. But I didn't want him dead. I wanted only to live quietly with Adrian, to leave the past behind. Now look, what's happened? Marcus is dead. Adrian knows the truth about me. Peter has been accused of murder, and you—" She shook her head. "You've destroyed your own life for nothing." "Not for nothing," Monica insisted, but her conviction was weakening. "For justice, for my mother." "Your mother wouldn't have wanted this," Miss Marple said softly. "She wanted to find her daughter, to know she was safe. Well, she is safe as she can be under the circumstances. Killing Marcus Bellamy didn't bring your mother back, Miss Heath. It only added another tragedy to the chain." For a long moment, Monica stood frozen, the gun wavering in her hand. Then slowly, her arm dropped and she began to sob, great wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. "I just wanted him to pay," she choked out. "I wanted him to suffer like my mother suffered, like Marie suffered. But you're right. It didn't help anything. It didn't bring her back. It didn't change the past." Peter moved forward carefully and took the gun from her unresisting hand. Adrian immediately went to telephone the police, while Celeste, surprisingly, approached Monica and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry about your mother," Celeste said quietly. "I never meant to hurt her. When I disappeared, I thought she'd be better off not knowing what I'd become. I didn't know she was searching for me." Monica looked up at her cousin through tear-filled eyes. "She never stopped loving you. Even when everyone else said you must be dead, she believed you were alive somewhere. She just wanted to know you were all right. I wish I had known. I would have written somehow. Let her know I was safe." "Nicole?" Two women stood together for a moment, bound by blood and shared tragedy, while Miss Marple watched with sad, knowing eyes. Human nature, she reflected, was always the same. People acted from love, from fear, from the desire to protect or avenge those they cared about. And those actions, however well-intentioned, so often led to tragedy. Inspector Slack arrived within half an hour, accompanied by Colonel Melchett. Monica made no attempt to deny her guilt. She confessed everything: the planning, the poison, the framing of Peter Carrington. She seemed almost relieved to have it out in the open, to no longer carry the burden of her secret alone. "We'll need statements from all of you," Slack said, looking around at the assembled group. "This is going to take most of the night." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple said, "though perhaps Mr. and Mrs. Thornbury might be allowed to speak privately first. They have much to discuss." Melchett looked at Adrian and Celeste, noting the careful distance between them, the pain in both their faces. "Very well. Half an hour, but don't leave the premises." After the police had taken Monica away, and the others had dispersed to give their statements, Miss Marple found herself alone in the conservatory, where Marcus Bellamy had died. The shattered portrait lay scattered across the floor, fragments of canvas and paint that had once captured a woman's desperate unhappiness. Peter Carrington joined her there, looking exhausted but no longer haunted. "Thank you, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "If you hadn't worked it out, I might have been convicted of a murder I didn't commit." "The truth has a way of emerging, Mr. Carrington. It simply needed time and patience to reveal itself." "What will happen to Celeste now? To her and Adrian?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "That depends on them, doesn't it? On whether love can survive betrayal, whether trust can be rebuilt on a foundation of lies. Some marriages weather such storms, others do not. I hope theirs does, Peter said. Despite everything, I think Adrian truly loves her, and she loves him. I can see it in how she looks at him, how frightened she is of losing him. And you, Mr. Carrington, what will you do now? Return to London, I suppose. Try to rebuild my career without Marcus. It won't be easy. He was my mentor, my teacher, whatever his faults. But perhaps... He paused, looking down at the destroyed portrait. Perhaps it's time I learned to see with my own eyes, to paint my own truths, rather than simply following his. Miss Marple smiled. That sounds like a very sensible plan. Chapter 9. Aftermath and Reflection. The trial of Monica Heath took place 3 months later at the Old Bailey in London. Miss Marple attended, sitting quietly in the gallery, as the prosecution laid out their case against the mystery writer who had turned her fictional knowledge of murder into deadly reality. Monica's defense team argued for leniency based on diminished responsibility, the grief over her mother's death, the discovery of her cousin's fate, the desire for justice against a man who had exploited vulnerable women. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded killer who had planned a perfect murder and attempted to frame an innocent man. In the end, the jury found her guilty, but recommended mercy. The judge, taking into account the circumstances and the genuine remorse Monica had shown, sentenced her to 20 years' imprisonment rather than death. Justice, Miss Marple murmured to Dr. Haydock, who had accompanied her to the trial, though one wonders if anyone truly wins in such cases. The law must be served, Dr. Haydock replied, but I take your point. This is a tragedy all around. Back in St. Mary Mead, life slowly returned to normal, though the events at Gossington Hall had left their mark on the village. The Thornburys had left shortly after giving their testimonies, and the house stood empty, waiting for new tenants who might not know its dark history. Mrs. Bantry called on Miss Marple one afternoon to discuss the latest news. "I've heard that the Thornburys have separated," she reported, settling into her usual chair with a cup of tea. "Not divorced, mind you, but living apart. Adrian has returned to London, and Celeste, or Marie, I suppose we should call her, has gone abroad. To Switzerland, someone said." "How sad," Miss Marple said, though she wasn't entirely surprised. Some betrayals ran too deep to forgive, even when love remained. "Peter Carrington has had his first exhibition," Mrs. Bantry continued. "Quite successful, apparently. The association with the Bellamy murder case gave him a certain notoriety, which helped draw attention to his work, though I understand his paintings are actually quite good on their own merits." "I'm glad to hear it. He deserved a chance to succeed on his own terms." And Monica Heath's publishers are releasing her final manuscript, written before all this happened, of course. They say it's selling quite well, with people eager to read the work of a real murderess. Mrs. Bantry shuddered delicately. How morbid. Miss Marple said nothing, but she thought about Monica Heath sitting in her prison cell, living out the plot of her own mystery novel. There was a certain grim appropriateness to it. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she worked on a new pattern. The case of Marcus Bellamy's murder was closed. Justice had been served, and life in St. Mary Mead continued its peaceful rhythm. But Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface of every peaceful village, every quiet life, lay secrets and passions that could erupt into violence given the right or wrong circumstances. Human nature was endlessly fascinating in its capacity for both good and evil, for love and hatred, for sacrifice and selfishness. She thought about the various players in this tragedy. Marcus Bellamy, whose ruthless pursuit of artistic truth had cost him his life. Celeste Thornbury, who had tried to escape her past only to have it destroy her future. Adrian Thornbury, betrayed by the woman he loved. Peter Carrington, caught between devotion and disillusionment. And Monica Heath, driven by love for her dead mother to commit murder in the name of justice. All for art, Miss Marple murmured to herself. Or perhaps all for love, which amounts to much the same thing in the end. Chapter 10. The Final Truth. 6 months after the trial, Miss Marple received an unexpected letter. It was from Celeste Thornbury, or Marie Deschamps, as she now signed herself, postmarked from Lausanne, Switzerland. Dear Miss Marple, I hope this letter finds you well. I have been thinking of you often these past months, reflecting on everything that happened and the role you played in uncovering the truth. I know I never properly thanked you, and I wanted to rectify that now. You were right about many things. About the secrets we keep destroying us in the end. About the impossibility of building a life on lies. I have learned these lessons at great cost. I wanted you to know that I have been in contact with Monica. I visit her as often as the prison allows. We have much to talk about. About my mother, about the life I lived in Paris, about the choices we both made. She is genuinely remorseful, Miss Marple, not just for the murder, but for the pain she caused me. She thought she was avenging me, but I never wanted vengeance. I wanted only peace. Adrian and I have begun corresponding as well. It is slow, painful work, but we are trying to understand each other, to see if there is anything left of our marriage worth saving. I cannot undo my deception, but I can be honest now. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps not. Time will tell. I have also made contact with my mother's family in France. Cousins and aunts I haven't seen since I was a girl. They welcomed me back, not with judgment but with love. It is strange to be Marie again after so many years of being Celeste, but also somehow right. I'm learning to accept both parts of myself, the girl I was and the woman I became. Thank you, Miss Marple, for seeing clearly when the rest of us were blinded by our own passions and fears. Thank you for seeking the truth, even when that truth was painful. And thank you for showing compassion to all of us, even those who did not deserve it. With sincere gratitude, Miss Marple read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in her writing desk. She sat for a long moment, looking out at her garden where spring flowers were beginning to bloom, thinking about redemption and forgiveness and the long, difficult path back from deception. Later that day, she had another visitor, Inspector Slack, stopping by on his way through the village. Just wanted to keep you informed, Miss Marple, he said, accepting a cup of tea with more grace than he had shown in their earlier encounters. Peter Carrington's exhibition was indeed successful. He's been commissioned to paint several portraits, including one of Lady Fortescue. Seems he's learned from Bellamy's mistakes. His portraits are kinder than his master's, more forgiving. People like that, I'm glad to hear it. And the Gossington Hall property, sold to a retired colonel and his wife from Bath. Nice couple, no interest in art or murder. Should be quite dull, really. Dull is sometimes exactly what's needed, Miss Marple observed with a slight smile. After Slack had gone, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, but her mind was still on the case. She thought about the portrait that had been at the centre of everything. The portrait that had revealed too much truth, that had exposed secrets better left hidden, that had ultimately led to murder. Marcus Bellamy had believed that art must reveal truth, that the canvas couldn't lie. But Miss Marple knew that truth was more complicated than that. Yes, lies destroyed, but sometimes the brutal exposure of truth destroyed just as thoroughly. There was an art to truth-telling, a kindness required in revelation. Bellamy had lacked that kindness, and it had cost him his life. Mrs. Bantry stopped by that evening for a final discussion of the case over sherry. I must say, Jane, I never would have suspected Monica Heath. She seemed so normal, so ordinary. That's the thing about murderers, dear, Miss Marple replied. They so often are ordinary. Murder is not committed by monsters, but by people. People driven by love, fear, anger, or a misguided sense of justice. Monica loved her mother and her cousin. That love led her to murder. It's not so very unusual when you think about it, I suppose not. Still, to plan it all so carefully, to frame poor Peter Carrington. Yes, that was the part that revealed her true character. The murder itself might have been a crime of passion, however carefully executed. But the framing of an innocent man showed calculation and a certain ruthlessness. She was willing to sacrifice anyone to achieve her goal of vengeance. Do you think she'll ever be released? Perhaps, if she serves her full sentence and demonstrates genuine rehabilitation. She'll be an old woman by then, but it's possible. And perhaps prison will teach her what her mother's love should have taught her. That vengeance solves nothing. That violence only begets more violence. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their sherry and watching the last light fade from the sky. Miss Marple thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by this tragedy. Some would recover, like Peter Carrington, building new lives from the ruins of the old. Some would struggle forward like Marie, trying to reconcile past and present. Some, like Monica, would pay for their choices with years of their lives. And some, like Marcus Bellamy, had paid the ultimate price. You know what strikes me as most tragic? Mrs. Bantry said suddenly. The waste of it all. Bellamy dead, Monica in prison, the Thornberrys' marriage destroyed, Peter's career nearly ruined. And for what? Because of things that happened years ago. Because of secrets and lies and the inability to forgive. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly. That is indeed tragic, but it's also very human. We carry our pasts with us, whether we want to or not. And sometimes those pasts rise up to destroy our present. How very gloomy, Jane, but also hopeful in its way. Because some people do manage to move forward. Marie is trying to reconcile with Adrian, to rebuild connections with her family. Peter is creating new art. Art that's his own rather than a shadow of Bellamy's. Even Monica, in her way, is facing the consequences of her actions rather than running from them. There's courage in that, even if there's also guilt. Mrs. Bantry nodded slowly. I suppose you're right. There's always hope, isn't there? Even in the darkest situations. There's always hope, Miss Marple confirmed. As long as we're willing to face the truth, not the brutal, unforgiving truth that Marcus Bellamy dealt in, but the compassionate truth that acknowledges human weakness while still expecting us to do better. After Mrs. Bantry left, Miss Marple sat alone with her thoughts. The case of the silent portrait, though it had spoken volumes in the end, was closed. Justice had been served, truth had been revealed, and life in St. Mary Mead continued its eternal rhythm. But Miss Marple knew that there would be other mysteries, other crimes, other secrets to uncover. Human nature didn't change after all. The same passions that had driven people to murder in ancient times drove them still. Love and hatred, greed and generosity, courage and cowardice. These were the eternal constants of human existence. She picked up her knitting, her needles clicking in the quiet room. Outside, the village settled into sleep, peaceful and seemingly innocent. But Miss Marple knew better. She knew that beneath every peaceful facade lay depths of emotion and potential for both good and evil. And she would be watching, always watching, with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and a mind that understood everything about the endless complications of human nature. Epilogue. Years later. 5 years after the events at Gossington Hall, Miss Marple received a wedding invitation. It was from Peter Carrington, who was marrying a young art teacher he had met at one of his exhibitions. The ceremony would be held in London, and he would be honoured if Miss Marple would attend. She went, of course, touched by the invitation, and curious to see how the young man had fared. She found him transformed, still serious, still carrying the intensity she remembered, but no longer haunted. He had become his own artist, no longer living in Bellamy's shadow. At the reception, Peter introduced her to his bride, a cheerful young woman with paint-stained fingers and a warm smile. "Sophie knows everything about what happened," he told Miss Marple. "No secrets, no lies. We promised each other that from the start." "How very wise," Miss Marple said approvingly. Later, Peter drew her aside. "I wanted you to know. I had a letter from Celeste last month. She and Adrian have reconciled. They're living quietly in the south of France, away from London society and all the old associations. She says they're happy, or learning to be happy, which amounts to much the same thing. I'm very glad to hear it. And Monica, I've been corresponding with her as well. She's different now, Miss Marple. Prison has changed her. Or perhaps she simply had time to reflect on what she did. She writes stories for the other inmates, teaches them to read. She says she's found a different kind of justice, not the vengeance she sought, but a way to help people rather than hurt them." "People can change," Miss Marple observed, "given time and the will to do so." "Yes, though some things don't change." Peter's expression grew more sombre. "I still dream about that day sometimes, about the portrait, about Marcus's body in the conservatory, about how close I came to being convicted of a murder I didn't commit. It's taught me something important, though." "What's that?" "That truth matters, but so does kindness. Marcus painted only what he saw, without compassion, without mercy. He revealed truths that destroyed people. I've tried to learn from that. To paint what I see, yes, but to paint it with love, to show people not just as they are, but as they might be, as they hope to be." Miss Marple smiled. "That sounds like wisdom, Mr. Carrington. Hard-won wisdom, but wisdom nonetheless." As she travelled back to St. Mary Mead that evening, Miss Marple reflected on how stories ended, or rather, how they didn't end, but simply transformed into new stories. The murder of Marcus Bellamy had been solved, justice had been served, but life went on. People learned, changed, grew, or sometimes they didn't, but that too was part of the human story. The train rattled through the darkening countryside, and Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her lap, her sharp eyes watching the passing scenery, but her mind far away. She thought about all the cases she had solved over the years, all the secrets she had uncovered, all the truths she had revealed. And she thought about the one great truth that underlay all the rest. That human beings were endlessly complex, capable of both terrible cruelty and profound kindness, and that understanding them required not just observation, but compassion. The silent portrait had spoken its truth in the end, not the truth Marcus Bellamy had intended, but a deeper truth about the price of deception, the cost of vengeance, and the possibility of redemption. It was a truth Miss Marple had seen played out countless times in countless ways in the small village of St. Mary Mead and beyond. As the train pulled into the station and Miss Marple gathered her belongings, she smiled to herself. Life would go on. Human nature would remain constant, and there would always be mysteries to solve. And she would be there, watching with her knitting needles and her keen understanding, ready to uncover whatever truths needed revealing. For in the end, that was what mattered. Not the clever deductions or the dramatic revelations, but the patient, compassionate understanding of why people did the terrible things they sometimes did, and the hope that understanding might lead to justice, and justice to healing. Miss Jane Marple stepped onto the platform at St. Mary Mead, home once again, ready for whatever mysteries life might bring.